Hey, this is Zen Zenith just sneaking in to say check out the House Show with Zen Zenith, that's me, on Dragon Wagon Radio. The House Show is a live concert series featuring stripped-down performances and interviews with amazing singer-songwriters. We do the whole thing in front of a real live audience at a real live house and package the whole thing up into a podcast for you to experience in the ease of your home or car. Real intimate performances, real intimate conversations with great people. Check it out at thehouseshowshow.com or on Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever else good podcasts are found. We'll see you there.
It's the greatest mystery in literary history. A divisive question with highly contested answers. Who was the writer behind the pen name William Shakespeare? Welcome to Don't Quill the Messenger. Here's your host, Stephen Sable.
Welcome back, my fellow quillers and fans of the program Don't Quill the Messenger. We're so glad to be back with you in our third year of podcast recordings. And today's episode, we welcome back one of our absolute favorite guests, one that some of you have requested that she come back to us for another episode. So we listened. And here she is. She is Bonner Miller Cutting. She has devoted decades to the study of Shakespeare, publishing articles, blogging, book reviews, giving talks at authorship conferences and academic venues. Her YouTube videos are presented by the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, and her interviews on the Stratford Man's Last Will and Testament are some of the ones that she's most known for and can be accessed on the Shakespeare Underground as well. She published a book last year called Necessary Mischief, which has taken many of us by storm. And if you don't already have a copy, go to Amazon and get one as soon as you finish listening to today's episode. And we're so glad to welcome her back. Bonner, thanks for coming.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's quite a pleasure to be here.
You know, when I contacted you about this episode, I know I indicated to you that we did have several guests over the last, or several listeners over the last year who requested you come back as a guest. And we spoke briefly about what topic we might cover. And we came upon today's topic not only because I think you have some very intriguing and interesting research into this topic that others in the Shakespeare authorship question community have not touched on, as well as we've had a lot of requests from listeners over the last 2 years that we explore these topics more thoroughly, oftentimes very controversial. And in fact, some of the members of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship have gone so far as to say that this is a topic that should no longer be discussed. Others have said, wait a minute, that's ridiculous. Why would we ever take any topic off the table? In your book, chapter 10, which is titled, She Will Not Be a Mother, you cover some very interesting aspects of what have become known over the decades as the Prince Tudor theories. And I say theories because there is more than one, and many people aren't aware of that, or if they are, they're not aware of the details of those. But one of the things that you say in the very first page of chapter 10, and I want to quote you, as you say that this inquiry, and this is a paraphrase till now, quote, this inquiry worth pursuing in spite of the dismay that it sometimes engenders. And I have to say, I absolutely agree with that statement.
Well, thank you for saying that, because it's kind of a dangerous thing to talk about. For one thing, it challenges a very deeply held notion. I hate to use that word notion, that people hold very dear in England, that Elizabeth the Queen was a virgin queen, and if she had a child, then obviously she's not a virgin queen. Well, and these theories, okay, both indicate she had a child.
Would you equate that to like people who follow the Christian religion and as Mary, the Virgin Mother of Christ? I mean, can we really believe that the Queen of England, during such a very licentious period of time, never actually ever accepted a man into her bed? I don't know that I can buy that.
Well, what I'm going to do today, yes, I understand what you're saying. But the person who really put this forth was Elizabeth herself. She was praised often as the Virgin Queen, that she was the one who put this into place. And it was really, there's a very important book called The Cult of Elizabeth, written by a very fine historian artist named Roy Strong, where all of these different that she had a cult following for this being the Virgin Queen, and she worked hard to cultivate it, to use the word. So at any rate, yes, it's something that people in England take very seriously and take very much to heart, that their great queen was a virgin. So when you start talking about did she have a child as a result of the Seymour affair or later, it's very disturbing to them.
Well, before we dive deeper into the idea that she may or may not have had one or even two illegitimate children, I mean, if you want to believe all the PT theories, she had at least two illegitimate children. And if you're completely anti-PT theory, then you believe she had no children. But let's set aside childbearing for a moment and let's touch on the aspect of life that leads to that, which is her sexuality. Are we, like I said, are we really to believe that she never once had an intimate physical affair with any of her courtiers, with any of the men who came in and out of her life? Because I'm certain that there are biographers who disagree with that and have pointed out some of the very, what I'd call steamy love affairs that she had with some of her courtiers. Most in... Go ahead.
Okay, well, she was in love her adult life. From the time she became queen, she was 25 years old. And this is what I think. I'm giving you my opinion. Different people may want to disagree with me. But she was in love with a man whose name was Robert Dudley. And she made him the Earl of Leicester. And just to straighten something out that's confusing to people who are fairly new to this, noble people are usually called by their title, not their actual family name. So his name was Robert Dudley, but he's usually called Leicester. Sometimes the Earl of Leicester, but generally just Leicester for short. And she was in love with Leicester. There's no question about it. Initially, and this is important to the whole Prince Tudor thing, that if she had a child, once she became queen, she would have had that child with Robert Dudley. And there were lots of rumors that she did. In fact, there was a scandalous libel that was composed in France, and then smuggled into England, called Leicester's Commonwealth. That's the name. People can look it up on the internet. And in this libel, it's claimed that she had many, many children with Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. I personally don't think she did, but that's just me. But if she did, once she became queen, the father of these children would have been Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester. For one thing, she immediately made him the master of the horse. And this is when they come to Hatfield House to tell her she's queen. Her older sister, Bloody Mary Tudor's died. And Robert Dudley apparently was with her at Hatfield House, along with William Cecil, getting everything prepared for her to embark on her years as the reigning Queen of England. And she immediately makes him master of the horse. Now, the reason that's important is that basically meant that he has to be at her side everywhere she goes. From then on, he stayed master of the horse until he died in 1588. So anytime she has to go from one palace to another, she goes on a progress, she goes here, she goes there, Robert Dudley has to be by her side because he is, as the master of the horse, he's the only one that can help her get on her horse and help her get off the horse. He is the only person who is allowed to publicly put his hands on Elizabeth. And she was incredibly infatuated with him, certainly early on in her reign, and generally, I think, stayed in love, was actually in love with him. So I don't think she had a series. People can envision a series of lovers. I don't think so. I think that Dudley was the man in her life. There was one little problem when she first became queen in the early 1560s. Well, she was 1588 and 1559, then getting on to 1560, she was so infatuated that she might have lost it and married him. And the other advisors, like William Cecil, were terrified that she'd do that. But there was one little problem. Dudley was already married.
Yes, and isn't there a part of that story that
Yes.
he kept that a secret from her, didn't he?
No, not this first marriage. It was his second marriage he kept a secret. And then his third marriage that he tried to keep a secret. Well, it's all very circuitous. But he was married to a woman named Amy Robsart. And the real scandal about that is very early on, I think the date was 1561, about the third year that Elizabeth was queen, maybe 1560. But Amy Robsart turns up dead in the manor home where she's living. Now, Dudley rarely went to see her. He basically, throughout Elizabeth's reign, he managed to have two more wives, and one of them he claimed was a mock wedding, and he had two children with the second supposed wife, and then he discarded her and married a third time secretly. And it's the third marriage that was a big secret. And then one of the ambassadors let out the story, and it made Elizabeth terribly, terribly furious. But she took out her fury on his wife, Lettice Knollys, and not on him. She still loved him. She was so furious because she loved him and he married somebody else.
Well, I happen to believe that her... And I feel it, and you would know better than I would whether or not the way she reacted to Oxford's affair with Anne Vavasour, or Vavassar, however people choose to pronounce it. I believe that her reaction to that affair was over the top in comparison to the other dalliances that were going on at court all the time. And I believe that reaction is indicative of a woman scorned, of a jealous lover. And so I happen to believe that she had a love-hate relationship or deep infatuation for Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, much in the same way that she felt at one time about Leicester.
I actually would very respectfully disagree with that, because I think the only man she ever truly loved was Leicester. So I think he was the person that she loved. However, because she had denied herself actual marriage, and whatever else she did or did not do, we don't know. But she became enraged whenever her ladies in waiting, that were around her, whenever they had actually the ladies in waiting came to court from not good families, and one of the reasons they wanted to come to court to serve Elizabeth is they wanted to find a husband. So when they finally found a husband, Elizabeth just went into hissy fits. Something to study, and I don't have it prepared here, is a very small number of her ladies in waiting. They were supposed to really never marry. And one of them, the Earl of Southampton, married Elizabeth Vernon, and he did it kind of on the sly. He did it secretly. He had gotten her pregnant. He came back from France to marry her. And once Elizabeth found that out, she immediately threw Elizabeth Vernon in the Fleet prison. Then she threw Southampton in the Fleet prison. I mean, she could really react to something that was going on like that. And they were married at this point. And of course, she threw Edward, when the affair with Anne Vavassar happened, and the child Edward Vere is born, she threw Anne in the tower. She threw Edward de Vere in the tower, and the newborn babe in the tower. So, and now Anne and the baby were let out rather quickly by her influential uncle, but Edward de Vere was kept in the tower for a long time. So she was definitely enraged by anyone else having a successful love affair that amounts to a marriage and having some sort of happiness in their life. So, and whether that, I think what I get from Elizabeth, and a lot of people might not like this, Elizabeth was very mean. She was miserly. She was a skinflint. She slapped people around. She spit on them. She expected people she was so out of line from what we would think of a great ruler today. And she's been, what's been written about her has papered all this over. She's painted as someone who is gracious and charming, and she could posture that way. But in fact, on her personal relationships, she was really mean. that's how I've come to see her. And I've read a lot of biographies about her. And the more I learn about her, the less I like her. But most of the biographies, especially the earlier ones in the 1800s and as you get more through the 20th century, biographies are getting less hagiographies and more realistic. And the more you know about Elizabeth, for example, the way she treated the soldiers who went off to fight the Armada, her sailors, when they came back, thousands of them died because she and William Cecil would not release money from their exchequer to feed them. So they didn't die at the hands of the enemy, Spain, who was attacking. They died after it was all over, and they disembarked, and they died of starvation.
Well, there's an area where you and I absolutely agree 100%. I think that she was extremely mean-spirited. I think that she was definitely the daughter of her father. And I think that if you look at both of those girls were the daughters of their father. When you look at Mary and what she ended up doing and who she became, I think, the apple did not fall far from that tree. And I think, we come upon, Lord Acton suddenly comes flying into mind because that kind of power cannot but corrupt. And I always say, and I'll say this over and over again, I'll challenge anyone to name me a woman in history who was more powerful than Queen Elizabeth. I believe that she was the most powerful woman in the history of history. Some people said, Cleopatra was a goddess in Egypt, and that's far more power. And Cleopatra had no choice but to attach herself to various men throughout her life in order to maintain her power. Elizabeth did not. And that's why I say Elizabeth was the most powerful woman to ever live.
Elizabeth certainly accomplished a lot, and she's certainly one of the most influential rulers. What she did is she was a tyrant at heart, but because she was a woman, and England was, and she was regarded as being illegitimate by all of Catholic Europe, which is France, the Catholic parts of France and Italy, and so she was a very nervous ruler, and she had to rule very carefully. Mostly, she dithered a lot, but she tried to, and she basically dealt very, what's the word I'm looking for, was very heavily dependent upon William Cecil Lord Burleigh, who did a very good job of advising her. She had him with her, and the success of her reign is to a large extent because he did advise her very well. But she herself, though she was a tyrant at heart and had a lot of power, had she used the full extent of her power, she would probably have been deposed. So she was a careful ruler in that looking at it from that point of view.
And you don't believe that at any point in her life, and I'm going to sort of backtrack into her early life in just a minute, but you don't believe at any point in her life that a woman who wielded power the way that she did never chose to wield her feminine power against some of the men in her court, that she never seduced or enticed a single one of them into her bed? Because I just certainly cannot buy that. I think that she would have used that power as well. And I think the whole virgin queen, methinks the lady protests too much.
Well, I know that I'm really going to sound very, very naive to say this, but I think the only man that she had some sort of, whatever the relationship was, we don't know, was Robert Dudley, the Earl of Essex. Excuse me, the Earl of Leicester. Now, she did take the Earl of Essex on after Dudley died, and the reason is he was Leicester's stepson. As many people may not be aware, that Leicester had married the Earl of Essex's mother. Lettice Knollys was the Countess of Essex before she became the Countess of Leicester. And I think part of it, and then, so her affection for Dudley, basically she transferred to the Earl of Essex. He was very handsome and he was younger, and if she did have an affair, she would have had the affair with the Earl of Essex, because she did definitely have a very tender, warm spot in her heart for a long time, till Essex absolutely blew it. And ultimately, we have the Essex Rebellion against her, and ultimately she cuts off his head.
And what obviously, he believed he had some sort of special intimacy with her above and beyond all other courtiers to have taken the liberties that he has taken, according to the historians that I've read about the incidences that occurred between the two of them.
I just want to comment. There's a historian that's the foremost historian of the Earl of Leicester, and his name is Simon Adams. He has some really great books about Leicester out there, and he says that Elizabeth, he says this straightforwardly, and because he really has commanded the facts, she said, did she use her feminine wiles on people around and about her? She actually had 4 favorites that were official favorites. One of them, of course, the one that I think she basically was involved with was Leicester. Then Earl of Essex, who's Leicester's stepson. Then Sir Walter Raleigh was someone that she was extremely fond of. And Sir Christopher Hatton, who she made her Lord Chancellor, was someone that she was extremely fond of. Although I think that the whatever the communication she had with Hatton was strictly, did not go to anything sexual, although Hatton pretended it did, and it really didn't. That's what historians think. And then, by the way, when Sir Walter Raleigh married, he married Elizabeth Throckmorton, and she pitched another hissy fit, and I think she threw them all in this prison for a while. So when he marries, she has another one of her tantrums. And those 4, and the other one that's left out is Edward de Vere, because he had a brief career in his early 20s as, quote, a favorite, but it seemed to not really materialize. Of course, she keeps him, after he has the love affair with Anne Vavassor and produces the child. He goes to the prison. Then he gets involved with a Catholic plot. He's back in prison again. And finally, these sessions in the Tower seem to have clarified his thought processes. And when he finally gets out the second time, he reconciles with his wife, Anne Cecil, and then they get back on their somewhat troubled marriage until Anne Cecil dies. Then it's one of the few marriages that the Queen approves of. This is interesting. When she so violently disapproved of many of her marriages, when Elizabeth Vernon married Southampton and Walter Raleigh married Elizabeth Throckmorton, these were causes for her to really be stormy and throw them in prison. She actually permitted, with her, the marriage of Edward de Vere to marry Anne Cecil. She permitted them, and she was attending at the wedding. She permitted Elizabeth Trentham, who had been one of her maids of honor for a long time. She permitted him to marry with her good graces, Elizabeth Trentham, and she permitted the marriage of his oldest daughter, Elizabeth, and she permitted the marriage of his middle daughter, Bridget. So 4 of a handful of marriages that she actually permitted are Edward de Vere's, and 2 of his and 2 of his own daughters that get married with her good graces.
That is a very, very interesting point, and not one that I think I've heard anyone really raise and point out as clearly as you just did, and something I think that requires some more investigation, because that intrigues me. I do want to talk, though, about Elizabeth before she was queen, because when we talk about what I will say the original Prince Tudor theory, which technically doesn't have anything to do in the initial stages with the Shakespearean canon, but does have to do with the young Princess Elizabeth, probably during a time period when there was never a thought that she would ever be queen. And she ends up in the home of her stepmother, for lack of a better term, one of her father's last wives. It was Catherine Parr, I believe. And you point out in chapter 10 of your book that while she is in the home of Catherine Parr is married to Thomas Seymour, and there are a lot of details about the theories behind the relationship between Seymour and the young Princess Elizabeth. Let's talk about that some.
Okay. What led me to there are 2. Let me straighten something out really good, because so many of your people who are listening to this in other countries, we're so overjoyed to have the outreach that you're getting with this, and that people are getting interested. And this is a funny point of departure. It would really be better if people who are just getting interested would look at the big picture and not get into this deep dive that I've done into these this particular Prince Tutor theory. But let me explain really quickly that there are two Prince Tutor theories that are out there. The first is the Seymour Prince Tutor theory, which is what you're asking me about right now. That did Elizabeth have an affair when she's 14 years old with a man named Thomas Seymour? And then, if she did, what happened and has a child, what happened to the child? Those are two separate issues. Often they're conflated, but in fact, they're two separate issues. And she was 14 years old at this time. And I'm going to talk about that more in a minute. But the other Prince Tutor theory. And Prince Tutor means that if Elizabeth she's a Tudor princess, so if she's had a child, this child is a Tudor prince. So that's why we get Prince Tutor, PT. So that's why they're called that for short. But the Southampton Prince Tutor theory, it deals with the proposal that she had an affair with Edward de Vere when he's an adult, when he's in his early 20s, and she is about 40, which is not inconceivable, and that she has a child with Edward de Vere, and then this child is placed in the home of the Southampton family, the Earls of Southampton. And the reason is to place these children in a significant home where they will become an earl and they will get the right education and the right upbringing, so that if they are Tudor princes, and someday, even if they are just, they'll certainly sit in the House of Lords and they'll be courtiers at the court of whoever the monarch is, and maybe they even have a claim to being king at some point. So they're getting the proper background for this. Now, both of these theories, as far as placing the child, have some major, major problems. And I don't know if there'll be time enough for me to go into those major problems. But the two questions, there are 4 questions involved in these two theories. A, did Elizabeth have a child when she's 14? B, what happened to the child? Then to the next Southampton, did Elizabeth have a child when she's 40 as a result of an affair with Edward de Vere? And then, if so, did this child get placed in the household of Southamptons? So we have 4 separate questions.
Okay, so let's talk about the foundation for the first one, though. There wouldn't be any speculation that Elizabeth may have had a child with Thomas Seymour if we didn't have some sort of evidence that bespeaks that there was a strange relationship there between the two of them while she lived in his household. Isn't that where it all begins?
Exactly.
And if we don't have that foundation, then we can't even speculate that they might have had a child together. We have to first talk about why we would believe they could have even had a sexual relationship together. Don't you think that's a better place to sort of start?
Oh, absolutely, yes. And I'm more than happy to talk about it because chapter 10 in my book is all about that. So, and I'll give you just a little preparatory to why I went into this, why I did this research on this thing. It was way back in about 2010, before the movie Anonymous came out in 2011, Roland Emmerich's movie called Anonymous. And he incorporates both of these theories into his film. And we were at a conference, and it was being discussed because we didn't know exactly how he would incorporate them. We were hoping he wouldn't, but in fact he did. And I decided at that point when I got back, I needed to find out what the historical basis was for all of this, if there was something. And what I found shocked even me. I was surprised. What I learned, and shall I tell the story now?
Yes.
Of Elizabeth in the household? Okay. Well, first of all, it should start with Henry VIII.
And I want to tell anybody, if you're listening to this in the car, if you're listening to this and your children are anywhere around, you probably need to put it on pause because it gets a little salacious. We're about to go into some really naughty territory here.
It's terrible. And I had a few people fuss at me as I'm looked upon as a Southern lady, and which I'd like to think I am, but they said, Bonner, you should not have been looking into this subject. This is too seamy a subject for you. You should stay on the portraits of this and the wills of Shakespeare, the stuff I had been doing. So yeah, but I got into it, and I was actually shocked with what I found. But let me tell the story a little bit. And yes, people put it on pause if they're in a car where children are around. When King Henry VIII died, Elizabeth's father, she was 13 years old. Now, his last wife, the one who was lucky enough to survive him, was Catherine Parr. It's kind of an interesting thing about Catherine Parr because she had a reputation of being a lovely person. She was nice looking. She was reasonably well educated. It's sort of funny. So forgive me for this sidebar to tell about Catherine Parr because it's so ironic what's going to happen to her after King Henry dies. But she is the queen that came from nowhere because King Henry VIII, after he had cut off the head of his fifth wife. About a year or so went by, and she had been married twice before. And with all this emphasis on King Henry marrying a virgin and having an heir, she had been married twice before and widowed and had not had children, so they considered that she could not have children. And he sent her, not long after her second husband died, he sent her an invitation to marry him. And wisely, because she was regarded as a very wise and discreet person, she said, well, I think I need to think about it. She didn't exactly jump at the chance to be queen, which was pretty smart. But at any rate, she did get married to him a month or so later. And she made it her business to be, she was certainly a good person. By modern standards, she would stand up very well as a very good person. She was warm and nurturing and did her best to bring together Henry VIII's three estranged children from his three different marriages. There was the older sister, who's going to be known to history as Bloody Mary, and then there's little Elizabeth, and then there's a little boy. And she hit it off especially well with Elizabeth. Mary was grown, and Mary was set up in her own household. But Elizabeth, she took under her wing, and they exchanged translations of things, and it was clear that they had a very warm and nurturing relationship. So when King Henry VIII dies at the end of January in 1547, it made all kinds of sense that Queen Catherine Parr, who's now survived him, will take Elizabeth to live with her at this house. She had several lovely manor homes. Her favorite was called Chelsea. And Elizabeth goes to live with her at Chelsea. Now, a little interesting thing that King Henry VIII also knew, in the interim, after her second husband had died and before she married King Henry VIII, she had somehow met and become infatuated with Thomas Seymour. Thomas Seymour was the brother of Jane Seymour, so he was basically King Henry VIII's brother-in-law.
The incestuous nature of all of these families and all of these people can sometimes get confusing, but it's also so much more, adds so much more to, you can't write this stuff, right? You cannot make this stuff up. It's impossible.
Really. So, and it's funny because extant is some sort of, I don't know if it's a letter or the document of a letter, but when she answered, after she accepted the offer of King Henry VIII to be his wife, his sixth wife, she sent a note to Thomas Seymour saying, I really love you, but it's my duty to marry the king. He wants to marry me, it's my duty to marry him. If that isn't kind of crazy, but she did. And he nearly had her executed at one point, but she managed to salvage her situation, and she survived this very dangerous marriage to this very dangerous man, Henry VIII. And then he also set her up, but he set her up well in her widowhood. She had two especially fine manor homes, and she brings Elizabeth to one of them. But what she does that the Privy Council would never have imagined, because she was known for being in control, she had self-control, she had discretion, she had done the job of being the Queen of Henry VIII very, very well. There was not a hint of scandal in anything that ever happened until within about 2 months, she marries Thomas Seymour. He comes back into her life, and she marries him way too fast. By April, they've married secretly, and by May, they're open with a marriage. Now, at this point, she is generally condemned by everybody at court. She's blown it. She's blown the wonderful reputation that she had. But at any rate, because, for one thing, Thomas Seymour is quite the ladies' man. He's something of a rake. He's also been appointed the highest military command that there is. He is now the Lord High Admiral. So he's generally referred to in history books as the Admiral. I mean, after all, his sister's been King Henry VIII's queen. His nephew is now the king, and now he's got the surviving spouse of the king as his wife, and little Elizabeth, the princess, is living with him at Chelsea. What happened, and this is starting in May of 1547. By Christmas of 1547, Catherine Parr and her entourage, which includes Elizabeth, go to his house in his London home, and apparently, this is horrible to say, but it's documented that he is accused of entering Elizabeth's bedchambers without his trousers on. Mm-hmm. Ta-da! Mm-hmm. It is said,
and she was, she didn't turn out to be the most beautiful older woman, especially after the smallpox and whatnot that affected her. But by all accounts, she was a very attractive young girl.
Yes, she is considered
with that fiery red hair and that fair alabaster skin, And, then you have these stories about Seymour and his womanizing and as I have read it, his quote unquote eclectic taste for women.
Yes, that's one of the biographers of, yeah.
And apparently he had no problem. And, one of the other things we have to think about too, like we're listening right now and I'm thinking, I have young daughters, and if anyone my daughters aren't even near teenagers yet, but you immediately think, whoa, what was he doing going after a 14-year-old girl? Except we have to remember that in Renaissance times, that's marrying age. That's,
it was. Yeah, exactly. Well, this carrying on, whether it started as innocent flirtations and it got out of hand, by the spring, when they're back at Chelsea again in her other manor home of Hanworth, he is routinely going to her bedroom in the Elizabeth's chambers in the morning in his bedclothes. And finally, the Queen, who is now pregnant herself after 3 husbands, the 2 before Henry VIII, married Henry VIII with no pregnancies, and now she herself is pregnant, and she starts accompanying her husband, as one biographer says, on these delightful morning trips, and it was all a prank. They enjoyed tickling Elizabeth when Elizabeth was in bed. That is how it is told historically.
Okay, so let me read between the lines here, Bonner. I don't want to offend your Southern lady sensibilities, but a husband and wife are venturing into the bedchamber of their teenage ward who is living in their home because they enjoy tickling her.
Something's really wrong with this picture.
This is we're venturing into soft pornography here if we're not careful.
It's very dangerous to even think about it. But it was really dangerous for Elizabeth. The Queen should have gotten her out of there immediately. And as soon as there was the slightest hint of something that was inappropriate, and apparently there were more than a lot of hits going on. But what happened? We now have 2 depositions and a series of interrogations that anybody who's listening to this can pull up on Google. Just put in Cecil Papers, edited by Samuel Haynes. You need that word, Haynes, Haynes, and they were published in 1740. And they are published, the papers that William Cecil apparently had at Hatfield House, dealing with the interrogations of the two people they call servants who were closest to Elizabeth. One was her cofferer, which was basically her chief financial officer, who was with her at all times. His name was Thomas Parry. And the other was her governess, Cat Ashley, who's with her all the time. And they are now interviewed, and they've been arrested, and they could have been tortured. So they're giving these depositions under great duress. And what Thomas Parry says is that the Queen, as he's explaining all these goings on, and a lot of what we know come from these interrogations, when they're being interrogated by the Privy Council. I mean, this is dangerous. If they could be executed for treason, for really allowing this horrible stuff to be going on under their noses. But at any rate, Thomas Parry says that the Queen, at some point not accidentally, came across, found Thomas Seymour, her husband, and Elizabeth alone in a room in an embrace. And at that point, she resolved to send Elizabeth away. Now, that's the story from Thomas Parry. The story from Cat Ashley is even worse. There's no timeline. This was happening, and the actual time is not fixed. A little bit vague, but as far as which one happened first. What Cat Ashley tells has been reported as the scene in the garden. And what happened in this scene, and I am the only one who has ever said in any sort of published way that this is a spin doctoring thing. What Cat Ashley says is that Elizabeth and her stepmother, the Queen, were walking in the garden, and you can be sure that the Queen had ladies about her, and that the Queen, this is the way it's told, the Queen held Elizabeth while Thomas Seymour happened to be around, and Thomas Seymour took a knife and he slashed Elizabeth's dress into 100 pieces.
100 pieces?
100 pieces. That is in Cat Ashley's. Actually, it is 100 pieces because it's more antiquated language than we have today. But yes, 100 pieces. And this is in the deposition. They can pull it up on the internet, and they can see it in the Haynes reporting of it in 1740 when he reproduces these these depositions. But the thing is that can't quite be true. What I believe is that the Queen is walking in the garden. The Queen has her ladies holding Elizabeth, and it's the Queen herself slashing Princess Elizabeth's dress, and she's trying to slash off her clothes to see if she's pregnant.
Oh.
And
so
Thomas Seymour.
There are two different angles to this. It could be.
That's my angle.
It could be that it was more of the three-way tickling going on, and Seymour had some sort of weird fantasy or fetish about wanting to rip off Elizabeth's clothes one strip at a time while his wife held her down and watched. That's one angle. Or you're saying that it's possible that it was the Queen herself who was tearing at Elizabeth's clothes in order to reveal whether or not she showed signs of pregnancy. But why 100 pieces? If you want to see whether she's pregnant or not, it wouldn't require the cutting of 100 pieces.
Well, she slashing away. They had these big, bulky dresses and attire, and she's slashing away at it. And I believe that Thomas Seymour arrived on the scene and struggled and ran interference and got the knife out of the Queen's hands. And so they come back, well, was he holding the knife? Well, sort of one of those setups. Well, yes, he's holding the knife, but for one thing, Thomas Seymour doesn't have any motivation to do this. The Queen has a lot of motivation to do this. The Queen is now a little bit unhinged because she's finally realized that and the rumor mill is going berserk with the rumors that Elizabeth is pregnant. And she's finally picked up on it, and she's finally going to see for herself. And that's why, for one thing, too, a knife is a lady's weapon. The Admiral, Thomas Seymour is the Admiral, he carried a sword. He wouldn't be doing anything that's beneath his dignity of slashing away at a girl's clothes with a knife. I mean, unless
it's some sort of weird sexual fetish behavior. That's what I'm saying.
No, not that. I think that for one thing too, this is an attack on the person of a Tudor royal member of the Tudor family, and this is actually punishable this is treason. It's an actual physical attack, and it is treason. And the only one who could get away with it is the Queen herself. Nobody else would be attacking because she's in such a high position of being the former Queen of England. And she's angry. She's lost it. I
would say that your research definitely, when you tie these things together, regardless of what the interpretation is, when you tie them together, the stories about the odd nature of the relationship between these three, the stories about Seymour visiting Elizabeth in her bedchambers. I also recall reading in your chapter 10 that there were accounts of him fondly touching her buttocks in public and in the presence of other people.
Yes.
When you tie that together now, even with your interpretation that it was the Queen, the Dowager Queen, trying to discover whether or not Elizabeth was pregnant with her husband's baby, I would say that all of that leads us to the next area of investigation, which is one that most of the people that I've talked to about this who are interested in this theory, the number one thing they ask is there any evidence that Elizabeth was spirited away or secluded or kept from view for the length of time necessary for her to conceal her enlarged belly in order to then have a baby in secret?
Wonderful question to ask. The answer is yes. When the Queen finally wises up and sends Elizabeth away, where does Elizabeth go? We're now talking about middle May of 1548. And Elizabeth is sent to the country manor home of Sir Anthony Denny. And this country home is called Cheshunt. Now, the question is, who is Sir Anthony Denny, and did he have a pregnant Tudor princess on his hands?
Is that a seaside area of Wessex?
I'm not sure. I'm not real sure. It's close to Tibbles, where William Cecil Lloyd Burleigh eventually built his stunning prodigy home. So you could get on a map and find out where Tibbles was, and it was in that area. But what's interesting about Sir Anthony Denny is that Sir Anthony Denny was King Henry VIII's closest friend, closest survivor, most trusted counselor. And in fact, King Henry VIII died in his arms. But Sir Anthony Denny was known as King Henry VIII's fixer. And now she's going to the safest place with the best person she could possibly get to deal with this issue. And once she goes to Cheshunt in May of 1548, she makes no public appearances. She is totally out of sight. One assumes that her own people were around her governess and her cofferer, but she is out of public view until the end of December when she's set up with her own household at Hatfield House. So that's 6 to 7 months.
And there are quite
time.
a number of events that occurred during that time period that she would have been or should have been compelled to attend as a person of her status and position of the time. Isn't that true?
Exactly. Yes.
But for some reason, she's conspicuously absent from major events, including the birth of the Dowager Queen's own child, a prominent funeral that occurs during that time, I want to say as well.
Yes.
I'm trying to remember as clearly as I can some of the details, but suddenly there are these major events where she should have been in attendance and is not. Instead, she's off in this seaside villa enjoying the salt air.
Wherever. Well, she's at Cheshunt for more than somewhere between 6 and 7 months, about 6.5 months, which is plenty enough time to ride out the pregnancy, get her delivered and recover, and then get her finally at Christmas time set up in her own household.
Okay, so now a big giant question.
Yes.
And I've never asked you this before, but I'll ask you now. Do you believe that she was spirited away in order to conceal a pregnancy and had a baby at that time?
Well, yes, exactly. Now, I wouldn't use the term spirited away because, I mean, she was clearly removed from the home with her stepmother and Thomas Seymour, the admiral, and she is put in the house. She's placed in a very important house. And by the way, we know very little. It's very hard to find out information about Sir Anthony Denny and Cheshunt. He ran a tight ship. As someone who was a very trusted, loyal servant of King Henry VIII would be expected to do. He pops up in history books here and there at very critical junctures, and he fixes things. He has things go smoothly. I mean, he is. This is the man who's going to manage. She's not just somewhere carrying on living somehow. She's now in the hands of the best manager that the Tudor administration has to take care of the situation. He's the equivalent of
today's Hollywood publicist, right?
Well, he's pretty darn good. And in fact, different historians, one calls him the smoothest operator of the era. Yeah, he was. And he's going to be mentioning. An interesting thing is Cat Ashley, who's been Elizabeth's beloved governess. Cat Ashley was put there, and historians believe this, because Sir Anthony Denny's wife is her sister. So he has actually chosen Cat Ashley. That's how she got the job as the governess of Elizabeth, because
she didn't do a very good job, did she?
Well, she historically,
if she couldn't keep Seymour away from the young princess, she wasn't doing her job.
And historians jump all over her for that. She's the one that gets beaten up for not, and historically that she gets condemned and beat up for not doing the job and not dealing with the situation in an effective way as it was happening. The problem was the Queen initially refused to believe it. And refused, even though these things were happening under her very nose in full sight, she refused to believe that there was a problem.
Well,
until it was too
part
late.
of that also to do with her closeness with Elizabeth, and maybe she didn't want to believe that the young Elizabeth would welcome her husband to her bed, or that would allow that to happen. So she's feeling doubly betrayed, perhaps, by both of them.
Well, certainly, yes. Yes, certainly. She's very seriously betrayed by her husband and by the young princess who she had loved and been the only mother that Elizabeth had ever known. Yes, she is deeply betrayed.
Okay, so what happened to the baby?
Which baby? Elizabeth's baby or Queen Catherine Parr's baby?
Elizabeth's baby. If we connect the dots, we have good reason to believe that Thomas Seymour impregnated the young princess Elizabeth Tudor, and she was whisked away into the hands of handlers and managers in order to keep her secluded for the length of time necessary for her to have a baby. And then that baby was deposited where?
I've been asked that a lot. And I've gotten some sort of really tough emails off and on after my chapter of my book came out. And well, at first it was an article in Brief Chronicles. And people would say, well, Bonner, if you're going to say there's a baby, you've got to say where the baby went. And I said back, no, I don't. I don't have to say that. For one thing, I looked at population studies that are out there, and they're in the sources in my books. The baby could have died. The childhood mortality was running about, and it's hard to say exactly, but about 40% of live births, didn't make it to be 10 years old. So we really don't know what happened to the baby. But this show,
I would be offended if I were you. That somebody demands that you must speculate. You're a bona fide researcher. These details that we've just discussed can be corroborated, and the reason we can have the belief that Seymour did have an illicit affair with her, that she was impregnated by him, that she was whisked away, is that the research supports that. But how could you be asked to, I mean, I asked you the question just now, what happened to the baby? But I don't mean to say that you have to have an answer for that if there is nothing to support any evidence of what happened to the baby.
Okay. I'm going to tell you what I think, and I'm going to give you you're the first person on your Quills podcast. I'm going to answer this question that I have refrained from answering now for nearly 10 years. I think this is what I believe happened to the baby. And I have some leg to stand on that for historical, biographical evidence. I believe that what happened at Cheshunt stayed at Cheshunt, at Sir Anthony Denny's home at Cheshunt. Now, historians do not know how many children Sir Anthony Denny had with his lovely wife, Joan, who was Cat Ashley's sister, by the way. I've already mentioned that. The old D&B says he had 6 children. The new D&B that was published in 2005 says he had 9 children. And one of the best historians of Anthony Denny says he had 12 children. Now, 12 is nearly impossible because his marriage to Joan only lasted 10 and a half years. And there is a report that his oldest child, in the old D&B, he had 4 sons and 2 daughters, and they list their names. Somehow in the 100 years to get to the 20th century, this 21st century, he managed to have 3 more children popped up, and they have him having 9 children. They have him having 5 sons and 4 daughters. So he had some more children a few hundred years later. And then I don't totally understand how in the world a fine historian like the man's name is Robert Hutchinson could think that they had 12 children in about 10-year marriage. And there's no record of twins. I mean, this is now you're getting physiologically impossible. But what I do believe, apparently, Anthony Denny accommodated and gave some and recognized 9 children in his will. Now, my sense of it is that one of those children is Elizabeth's.
Okay, and that would make sense to me in this idea. In this idea is that at the time, and I point this out again and again because I think this is important. At the time, no one ever suspected she would ultimately become Queen of England. It was not a thought at that time. So the idea that this baby could be a future king and therefore needs to be placed in a prominent house or where it can become an earl or that kind of a thing might not have been on the map because she was so far removed from the crown at that time. However, I do believe that there is some evidence in the historical record outside of the Shakespearean canon, just within the history of the Elizabethan era, that there were prominent earls who were having difficulty fathering sons, and that there may have been times when a bastard child was accepted as a legitimate child, where an earl had an affair with a mistress who bore him a son, and they claimed it was actually his wife's son, so that title could continue. And so I don't think it would be too far-fetched to say if you had a 16th Earl of Oxford who had no heir and needed one, and you suddenly had a male child of
available
noble blood, it certainly would be. It would certainly kill two birds with one stone, so to speak. Right?
Okay. I'm going to respond to that, and maybe and say something that I don't think that is taken into consideration. It would have been a bad idea to put a child of Elizabeth. Now, maybe someone not quite as highborn as Elizabeth is a royal princess, but it would have been a really bad idea to put either of Elizabeth's, or certainly this child that's born when Elizabeth is 14, or if there was a child later who becomes Earl of Southampton, they just would not have put this child in such a high profile. It sounds great. Wow, let's take this child of this person and let's give them to this other family. That would have been really difficult to do, especially with Elizabeth, because these great families, these great magnates who had all this wealth and all these homes, they had great households. And one of the problems with the Queen's household, and why the rumor mill went berserk, as I've said before, is because the Queen had over 200 servants there. Generally, these households of these great these earls and these grandee families had 60 to 100 servants. So you basically immediately have, it's a bad idea. So you immediately have a lot of people who are looking at who know things about the goings on of the household. Secondly, grandee families watched each other very carefully. It would have been quite a feat to successfully do a changeling child into a grandee family, because with all these servants going around, some of them were spying and they had families here and there, and that in and of itself would have been quite a feat, because all of these other families were incredibly attuned to what's going on and there were about 55 families in the aristocracy. You've got about 55
I always
families.
get a kick out of when I'm watching a film that is a historical period piece, and there's some member of royalty and their top general or their spouse or someone that they're plotting some conspiracy of some sort, and there are like 8 servants standing around in the room who are all pretending not to hear anything, and I always think to myself, how is this possible?
Well, the worst problem of all, and of course, all of these other families are very attuned to this. Do they have a legitimate heir? There's something that these grandee families had to go through, and the property class did. They had to go through, and once the person died, the earl, the great person, the baron, the viscount, the marquess, whoever he was, when he died, he would be absolutely subjected to an inquisition post-mortem. Now, when I first heard about Inquisition postmortems, I thought, well, these are important people and they want to be sure that there was nothing scandalous about the way they died. No. The jury, this was a jury at a court, but they didn't care a whit about how the old guy kicked the bucket. What they cared about was the property that he owned, and was his heir legitimate to be able to inherit it. That is what the whole purpose of the Inquisition post-mortem was all about. And if there was the slightest rumor, anybody picked up on anything or had any reason to believe that the child wasn't a proper age or there was some issue, this was a jury trial with a court, and everybody who was connected to the birth, whether it was the servants, whether it was the people delivering the baby, whether it was the wet nurses that nursed the baby, whether it was the rockers who rocked the baby, whether it was the clergy that baptized the baby, they would all be called up to this court to give their recollections of the birth of this child and when it was, to verify the day and the date that the heir was born and that this was a legitimate heir.
Now,
So
that's
the
first time I've heard anyone describe that process, and I don't believe that it is commonly talked about when this discussion happens in the community of the Shakespeare authorship question and with regards to either of the Prince Tudor theories.
It hasn't been, and that's one of the main things that I want to point. Thank you for giving me these wonderful opportunities to go through this, and you've led this discussion so well, as you always do, and I appreciate that, because this is a very important point that does get overlooked.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Like I said, just in this program alone, you have mentioned several things that I had not heard before, that I was not aware of. And this is a topic that I am quite interested in. Sometimes, too, as you know, when you start delving into this topic, it can release vitriol upon you from certain sources within the SAQ community. And so I'm glad to have been enlightened into some of these other details and factors that now make me have to rethink some of my own beliefs, some of my own theories, and re-examine some of the research that I've done, go back and read some of my favorite writers on this topic, and look at it with that lens in mind now. And we haven't even really touched at all on the Southampton Prince Tudor theory, because I felt it was more important to begin at the beginning, as it were, and do this chronologically. So we're going to have to schedule another episode just to go into that one, because we've already eaten up almost the entire hour
that's
just
right,
on this
yeah.
portion of it alone. But I think it's wonderful. And I think it's important, and it demonstrates very clearly why it is so important that we continue to have this discussion, and we continue to look into and investigate every theory, every idea involved in trying to get to the bottom line, which is ultimately the real truth, if we can.
I agree with that. I think you've summed it up perfectly. And I do want to just say one more thing, that it would have been a very risky business to be putting a child of Elizabeth in such a high-profile place, for all of these reasons, a high-profile place, and as an earl. And to make matters worse, just to close, of the 55 families that were in the aristocracy, if they were going to be looking at an aristocratic family to put this child with, the very last one at the bottom of the list would have been the Earl of Oxford. He would have been 55 out of 55, because something else that people don't know, or they haven't really factored into this, that the Oxford earldom was on the chopping block. And one more thing I want to point out is the wonderful article by Nina Green that was published in Brief Chronicles in 2009, The Fall of the House of Oxford. Now, as it turned out, the Earl of Oxford, John de Vere, was able to reconstitute his earldom and get his property back, but the earldom itself was scheduled for extinction. So that is not a place. The child had to go somewhere, but I believe the child stayed at Cheshunt, where the child was born. But the idea that this child was a changeling into the household of the Earl of Oxford just is really just certainly not the case that happened.
Well, I have to say that I agree with you on that bound. I believe that there is strong evidence, as you have pointed out, that Thomas Seymour had an illicit affair with the Princess Elizabeth. I believe that relationship probably helped fashion her later development as a woman later in life. It does seem to me that there's strong evidence that she found herself pregnant. There's strong evidence that Thomas Seymour was a very virile man, in that his wife, Catherine Parr, was unable to conceive with her previous two husbands and suddenly is pregnant by Thomas Seymour. So he had good seed, apparently. And so there's even that part to add to it. And I believe that, she most likely did have that baby. As you say, who knows, their high mortality rate, the baby could have died. She was awfully young, and that could not have made matters better with regards. There was a high stress pregnancy, obviously, to have to conceal it and keep it a secret. And again, your argument that baby, there's no reason why that baby wouldn't have just stayed in the household of the man who was keeping it a secret, rather than trying to, thrust it upon some other place. It doesn't make sense strategically at the time that it would go to John de Vere, the 16th Earl of Oxford. There would have been no political reason for that at that time. I think sometimes we look back at it and go, oh, well, but then look, John de Vere died mysteriously, perhaps even by poison, and then the 17th Earl of Oxford ends up under William Cecil's wardship, and all that money gets absorbed by the crown. Yeah, but they couldn't have thought that far ahead at the time. There would have been no way for them to be planning that in that way. So I'm with you. I have to agree that I don't believe that Edward de Vere is the illegitimate son of Queen Elizabeth. Now, with regards to Southampton, that's going to have to be another topic for another day because I have different beliefs about that. But we definitely have. We've exhausted the hour quite well, and which is great because that just means that it gives me an excuse to invite you back and to set up another episode this year on this topic that we have been requested so many times to explore further. But hopefully our listeners now are far more enlightened into the difference between the two theories, why they exist, especially the first one, and will now want to go and investigate further on their own by reading your book, which is, I think, one of the best places to start. It is called Necessary Mischief, Exploring the Shakespeare Authorship Question by Bonner Miller Cutting. You can find it at Amazon and other booksellers as well. It is a wonderful read on a variety of topics, not just this topic. And there are 10 chapters. The chapter we covered today is the last chapter of the book, the 10th chapter of the book. No reading ahead. So when you buy the book, you have to start at the beginning. No reading ahead. Bonner, I want to thank you so much for spending time with us today on this intriguing topic and sharing these insights. As I said, I have new things to explore now. My mind is blown.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I've been enjoying your podcast. And I think what you're doing is just wonderful. You're bringing all kinds of people on board who have interesting things to say and a lot of knowledge and to impart. And I'm very, very pleased and proud and honored to be one of them. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I will also remind our listeners, Bonner is currently now serving on the Board of Trustees of the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship. If you'd like to learn more about the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, the proud sponsor of this podcast series, you can visit shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org, shakespeareoxfordfellowship.org. It is your source and resource for all things Shakespeare authorship question. There are a plethora of resources available there for you to explore. You could rabbit hole into that website for hours upon hours if you are more interested in this topic or even specific detailed topics. There's a great search bar. You can type in certain names, certain particular topics, and find what is available there. Articles, research, links to other websites. It's a wonderful source to really delve into the specific areas that may be intriguing you about the Shakespeare authorship question mystery. And if you haven't already, if you've been considering, we do want to encourage you, please join the organization. Your dues help to support this program, help to support our other outreach efforts, and help to shed light on the truth of this topic. It can fuel research into the topic and can also help reach others who need to be aware of the topic and who hopefully will become a fellow quiller just like you. Thank you for joining us on this episode of Don't Quill the Messenger. And as always, fellow quillers, keep asking questions.
If you've enjoyed today's episode, please leave a rating and review in your podcast player. For even more, visit our website, don'tquillthepodcast.com. There you can find official merchandise in our shop, as well as a link to our Patreon. This show is made possible by people like you. We hope you'll consider showing your support by becoming a monthly patron, where you'll receive bonus material and tons of exclusive perks. You can also join in the conversation on our Discord and by following us at Don't Quill the Pod on all social media. All of this can be found at don'tquillthepodcast.com, don'tquillthepodcast.com.
Dragon Wagon.